Well, we welcome you to the final Clark Broadcasting Candidates Forum ahead of the November 8th primary election. I'm BJ Hansen, your moderator. Today, we are pleased to have the candidates for U.S. House District 5 in studio with us here in downtown Sonora. They are incumbent Republican Congressman Tom McClintock and the Democratic challenger, Mike Barkley. It is a geographically very large district covering all or parts of Tuolumne, Amador, Calaveras, El Dorado, Mariposa, Stanislaus, Madera, and Fresno counties. There will be time for opening statements, then a series of questions that both candidates will answer, and then some closing comments. If any of the candidates personally attacks the other, there will be 15 seconds allowed to respond if they so choose. Opening and closing comments are up to 3 minutes, and the time limit for question responses is 2 minutes. If time does run over, I'll have to interrupt and move to the next person. We're going to get into a number of issues, and we will start with opening statements. And Mr. Barkley, you can go first.
My name is Mike Barkley. I'm a Democrat. I'm a lawyer, an inactive CPA, a computer programmer. I own a small business I started in 1972, which is doing pretty well and is helping pay for all this. I own a ranch with my brother 40 miles west of Chico out in the hills, parts of which have been in the family since the 1850s. I grew up in the Central Valley and the East Bay. I spent 4 years in the Navy.
All right, thank you. And Congressman McClintock, opening statements.
Well, thank you, BJ. Thank you for doing this today. My thanks to KVML for hosting this discussion, which is an important one. It's about the future of our country, the prosperity of our families, the security of our borders, the safety of our communities, our most cherished freedoms as Americans are all at stake in this election. As you know, I'm the ranking member of the House Immigration Subcommittee. I've been fighting to stop the unprecedented illegal mass migration that threatens to undermine the well-being, the sovereignty, and the survival of our nation. I'm also a senior member of the House Budget Committee. My work to rein in wasteful government spending has won consistent praise from groups ranging from the National Taxpayers Union to Citizens Against Government Waste. I've fought these ruinous lockdowns and school closures and mask and vaccine mandates from the beginning. For 14 years, I pushed to restore active forest management and development of our water and power resources on the House Natural Resources Committee. But ultimately, I think this election is going to decide whether we succumb to the empty promises of big government socialism or restore the uniquely American principles of individual liberty, constitutionally limited government, and personal responsibility that made ours the happiest and most free nation on earth. Freedom works. Government overregulation and overtaxation has made a mess of our lives. A healthy, competitive, consumer-driven economy can restore the abundance, excellence, and reliability of all those things upon which our quality of life depends. You folks sent me to Washington to fight for these principles, and I'm going to need your support in this election to continue that fight in the crucial days ahead for our nation. Thank you.
Thank you both for your opening statements, and we'll now move into the question portion. I'll start with Congressman McClintock on this first one. The rising price of goods, inflation, is having a big impact on everyone. What should be done in response to this at the federal level?
It's not complicated. Stop spending and printing money we don't have. That's the very definition of inflation, too many dollars chasing too few goods. When the Trump administration ended, we were at about 1% inflation rate. We're at 8.2% today. It's the highest inflation rate in 40 years. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because of the passage of a $2 trillion American Rescue Plan, they called it, that spent an enormous amount of money that had to be printed. They reduced productivity. At the same time, they were flooding the economy with dollars. And that is a classic recipe for inflation. We all warned them it was going to happen. And it wasn't just Republicans warning. Democratic economists warned. Larry Summers, Steve Ratner, all warned this administration that this was going to ignite a wicked inflation. Every Republican in the Congress voted against that bill. Every Democrat voted for it. They ignored our warnings, and we're dealing now with a ruinous inflation. All of that free money that they sent us, turns out it's very expensive. And Americans are now paying it back every day at the grocery store, at the gas station, everywhere they spend a dollar. It was just a report released this past week that the average American has lost $4,000 in real income because of this inflation. The average life savings reduced $34,000 because of this inflation, and it was all self-inflicted. There's a very simple way to stop it: stop spending and printing money we don't have.
And same question for Mr. Barkley. Rising price of goods and inflation is having a big impact on everyone. What should be done in response to this at the federal level?
Well, there are other things that can be done in addition to what the congressman has said. Inflation is multiple things. It's gasoline here and other things there. We have ways that we can reduce the cost of gasoline now. We have ways that we can reduce the cost of housing now. Congress is a difficult place to get things done. The margins are very tight. There are three basic parties, Democrats, Republicans, and the Manchin Sinema Party. And that means there's a lot of negotiation has to go on to get even the least things done. One of the most effective ways to offset the balance of gasoline now is to do something that Mr. McClintock's constituency would call him a hero for if he chose to do it, and that is to adopt Medicare for all now. No more premiums, no more copays, no more deductibles. From here on, no more health care costs for the individual. He would be a hero to his people. That would reduce the cost of medical attention so much as to offset those others that are harder to reduce. If we wanted to reduce gasoline costs, the government could give away 1 million electric cars, because used cars are another component of the inflation. Those used cars could be taken in trade and refurbished and sold on the used car market. That would reduce the cost of gasoline. That would reduce the cost of cars now. The third thing in that list is the cost of housing. Starting with the Tax Reform Act in 1986, the tax incentive, next time.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Appreciate both of your answers to that first question. And the next one is focusing on fire. We'll start with Mr. Barkley on this one. What can the federal government do in hopes of reducing the amount and size of the fires that we've witnessed in the Sierra over the past decade?
More attention to climate change, of course. Remove the slash from the forests, widen the forestry roads, widen the escape routes for people, improve the availability of casualty and liability insurance for the homeowners, thin out all of these dead trees. Do it immediately. Pay the forest fire workers for the federal government the same as the state forest fire workers get done. Add incentives for hardening houses against fire, covering vents, making fireproof roofs, reducing the amount of burnable material around houses. All of these things can be done, and there's many more things too. Instead, we just hear about them year after year, and there are local programs, but there's nothing we can see from the federal government, despite the congressman's good efforts on the committee.
And Congressman McClintock, same question. What can the federal government do in hopes of reducing the amount and size of the fires we've witnessed in the Sierra over the past decade?
Well, BJ, we've been talking about this for a long time on this show, and as I've often said, all of that excess timber comes out of the forest one way or the other. Either we carry it out or nature will burn it out. Throughout the 20th century, we carried out the excess timber that produced a thriving and resilient forest and a thriving local economy. 25% of the federal timber auctions went right back into local government coffers. The other 75% went to the Forest Service to invest back into our forests. In the 1970s, we passed environmental laws that have made active forest management all but impossible. The result is our forests are now densely overgrown, morbidly overgrown, and they're doing what a garden left alone for 50 years will do. It will grow and grow until it chokes itself to death. The good news is we know how to manage a forest. We did so very effectively throughout most of the 20th century. My legislation made its way into the Wynne Act in 2016 for the Tahoe Basin. That streamlined the regulations that are preventing active forest management. It allows a categorical exclusion from the National Environmental Policy Act for projects over 10,000 or up to 10,000 acres. That was used very extensively throughout the Tahoe Basin. The result is it saved South Lake Tahoe from burning in the Caldor fire. The fire hit a 10,000-acre tract of land treated under that authority in my legislation and laid down, and they were able to stop it. But we've got to extend that throughout the rest of the Forest Service lands, and I have legislation to do that. Now, under Nancy Pelosi, we can't even get a hearing. Perhaps next year with Republican Congress we will.
And we're going to move on to the next question. I'm going to stay with Congressman McClintock. Roe v. Wade has been watched nationally and has been a high-profile issue. You know, your reaction to the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, and would you like to see any type of federal actions following it?
Well, what the the Supreme Court said was they can't find abortion listed in the Constitution. I agree with that. That puts the decision back in the hands of the people's representatives. I don't think most people are absolutist on this issue. I think most people don't want to see it banned outright. But they also don't want to see the hideous practice of late-term abortions. They're in the middle. That's what the voters in Kansas told us. That's what the survey data has told us. It seems to me we've got a pretty simple consensus that's already formed in our society over when life begins. If you have a patient in a hospital bed that has a brain wave and a heartbeat, there's a general consensus that is a human being. You can't just stab it in the skull. If those principles exist at the end of life, shouldn't they also be applied at the beginning of life? That's exactly what the Mississippi law did. It banned it after the first 15 weeks of gestation. That, I think, offers us a roadmap to how states ought to be responding to the Dobbs decision.
And Mr. Barkley, your reaction to the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, and would you like to see any type of federal actions following it?
The congressman's comments on forestry are well said, and I would like to see more of that. Back to abortion. Abortion is not the problem. The problem is that for 200 years, women have fought to be treated like human beings and not property. They got the right to vote. They wrote the Equal Rights Act, Equal Rights Amendment, which has been torpedoed. They gained the right to own and operate their own property at the turn of the last century. They managed to get the right to have their own credit cards in the 1970s, about the same time as Roe versus Wade was adopted. They got the right to wear slacks in court. Now, policies like that advocated by the congressman are turning back the clock to where women are property again. Now, if they want to pay a woman to have a baby instead of an abortion, that's fine. That's a deal between you and them. But if they want to take away the right to control their own bodies, that's outrageous. Women are being treated like property again by the Republican Party, and this needs to stop.
You're hitting on a wide range of topics during this candidate forum. Next thing I want to ask you about is water, especially in light of 3 consecutive dry years. What do you think the priorities of Congress should be in relation to water, starting first with Mr. Barkley?
On my website is a plan taken from a 1966 report from the Army Corps of Engineers following the floods on the Eel River. It provides for 43 million acre-feet of additional storage, 3 new conveyances, and it will store enough to reduce the threat of flooding in California, as well as to provide enough water to get us through every drought. Congress needs to look at that now. One aspect of that in Stanislaus County is the new Melones Reservoir. They built that thing, I believe, with 128 million cubic feet a second of bypass capacity. In January 1862, I believe the flow at that point was 280,000 cubic feet a second, twice. When you overtop an earth-fill dam, bad things happen. There's 250,000 of us live downstream from it. They need to triple the size of that, the width of that spillway, and provide a way to get 250,000 of us out of its way.
Congressman McClintock, same question. What should Congress's priorities be in relation to water?
Well, BJ, as you know, I chaired the Water and Power Subcommittee of Natural Resources for several terms when the Republicans last had the majority, and I'll tell you what I learned. Droughts are nature's fault. They happen. Water shortages are our fault. Water shortages are a choice we made a generation ago when the very same laws that have kept us from properly managing our forests have also made it impossible for us to build new storage capacity. We haven't built a major storage facility over 1 million acre feet since the New Melones back in 1969. Meanwhile, the population's doubled, and now we're suffering the irony of living in one of the most water-rich regions of the country and yet suffering from water shortages. We are not going to solve our water shortages until we build more dams, and we're not going to build more dams until we overhaul these same environmental regulations. I introduced legislation several Congresses ago to streamline that process as well. It placed one agency, the Bureau of Reclamation, in charge of all new dam applications, required those applications, instead of being considered consecutively by the various agencies, to be considered concurrently. They all had to run at the same time with a date certain for a conclusion. That bill passed the House, but we couldn't get past the 60-vote cloture threshold in the Senate. I have high hopes that we'll be able to get that passed in the new Congress next year.
Congressman McClintock, staying with you, how about the issue of immigration and the southern border? How do you feel things are going down there, and what, if any, changes should be made?
Well, I've made 6 visits down there so far, and I have to tell you, the border is wide open. There is no control over it. I have watched hundreds of illegal migrants pour across the Rio Grande, spent about 15 minutes being interviewed by Customs and Border Patrol, and then immediately put on buses to be taken to airports and bus terminals to be released throughout the country. We've had 1.5 million illegal migrants deliberately admitted into this country by this administration, while the Border Patrol has been changing diapers and overwhelmed by this influx. Nearly 1 million gotaways have gone around them. That's 2.5 million illegal migrants admitted into this country. You explain to me how it helps our schools to flood our classrooms with non-English speaking students. How does it make our hospitals more accessible by flooding emergency rooms with illegals demanding care? How does it help working families to flood the labor market with cheap illegal labor? How does it make our communities safer, making it all but impossible to deport criminal illegal aliens? We know how to secure the border. We did it under the Trump administration. The Remain in Mexico policy had slowed illegal migration to a trickle. The border wall was nearing completion, and we were, get this, we were actually enforcing court-ordered deportations. We had taken control of the border. All of those policies were reversed by Joe Biden on the very first day in office, and now we have a illegal mass migration literally of unprecedented numbers. I don't know of any civilization in history that has survived this level of mass migration, and Gallup tells us, by their own polling, they expect 42 million migrants just in Latin America and the Caribbean to be heading here, and they are.
And Mr. Barkley, same question. Immigration in the southern border, how do you feel things are going down there, and what, if any, changes should be made?
I think things are not going well. Senator Bernie Sanders put forth a plan back when he was running. It was on his website. I don't know if it's still there or not, which seemed fair to everyone, including the people seeking asylums and the border states. I would like to return to that kind of reaction. The Trump policy of forcing people to remain on the other side of the border in basically squatter camps has made them subject to all sorts of crime, kidnapping, murder, theft, that kind of stuff. I don't think that's fair either. If a person has a right to come to this country and seek asylum, they need to be treated under our current federal laws and not exiled.
Mr. Barkley, we'll stay with you for the next question. And looking at your campaign materials and websites, I know you both have different opinions on the issue of health care. So I'm curious, what role do you feel the federal government should have in regards to health care systems and health insurance?
Medicare for all, no premiums, no deductibles, no copays. Civilized countries in the world do that. Why can't we? If you repeal the Trump tax cut, that'll more than pay for it. Like Donald Trump said when he walked into Mar-a-Lago, says, "I just made you people a whole bunch of money." Well, that was off the backs of the middle class and the poor.
Congressman McClintock, same question. What do you feel the role of the federal government should be in regards to healthcare systems and health insurance?
Well, first of all, it was the Trump tax cuts that produced one of the biggest economic expansions in our nation's history. We actually collected more revenue after the tax cuts than we had before them because the economy grew so rapidly. Repealing the tax cuts will cost us revenues. It's not going to produce revenues. According to the Medicare actuaries, Medicare is expected to bankrupt by 2028 without serious reform. That's with people in the system right now who have spent their entire lifetimes paying into that system, expecting those services will be there for them when they retire. Of adding an entire population that has paid no premiums all of those years simply accelerates the bankruptcy of Medicare. In fact, we've seen that deadline accelerate because of Obamacare. It was passed over my objections. You look at the rising prices. One of the fastest rising sectors in prices is healthcare. Wasn't the Affordable Care Act supposed to get that under control? I would think twice before putting the same people who run the DMV, the post office, and the IRS in charge of our health care. We know how to produce the finest health care system in the world. We used to have it. It was by encouraging competition and allowing people the freedom of choice to choose the plan that best meets their own needs. That means shopping across state lines. If you can find a policy that better meets your needs at a lower cost in another state, why shouldn't you be allowed to purchase that policy? You can do that for your auto insurance. You can't do that for your health care. The Bernie Sanders Medicare for All plan, don't forget, forbids private insurance, which means that those who currently have plans in the private sector lose it.
Another hot-button topic, Congressman McClintock, has been President Biden's student loan forgiveness. What is your opinion?
I think it is outrageous on so many different levels. It is certainly grossly unfair to all of those folks who took out loans and paid them back, or for that matter, all of those folks who didn't go to college, who worked their way through college, never took out loans to begin with. Now you're asking them to pay back the loans of students who have not paid them back. That is a middle finger to the entire working class of our country. You're asking them to pay for the educations of those who generally are making more money than they are. So that the fairness of it is reprehensible. The other issue is, when did we give the president the right to spend $500 billion at whim? $500 billion is about $8,000 from every family in America. So $500 billion, you're talking about $4,000 from an average family to pay off these loans. This is beyond the pall, and I think that a Republican Congress is going to weigh in on that immediately. It has to. It cannot stand from a constitutional standpoint, and fiscally, it is incredibly reckless.
Mr. Barkley, President Biden's student loan forgiveness, what's your opinion?
Once again, the congressman puts forth his policy of oppressing the poor and the middle class. The student loan program is pretty much the only way a lot of people have to get through college. And to get through college is pretty much a necessity these days. Eliminating tuition at the community college level would help a lot. But my wife is disabled. She took out student loans back when she got disabled in order to get through college, and she worked for years and never did all that well. But we are both in our 70s, and every month I write that check, and she has no way of earning it herself, so I'm paying for that student loan payment, which I have no problem doing, but why she is still stuck with that loan puzzles me. But she's just one person amongst millions who pay these loans who have no way to pay them.
Was kind of a direct attack, Congressman McClintock.
Talking about oppressing the poor and middle class, he's asking the poor and working class to pay off his bills. of poor and working class who didn't go to college being forced to pay off the loans for those privileged who did.
Moving on to the next question, we'll start with Mr. Barkley. You know, one thing you both have touched on a little bit is gas and energy. I'm curious your take on what the federal government should do in response to rising gas prices and energy prices.
Well, first they should offset it with lowering medical prices. But beyond that, if the government wants the gas prices to drop, the government can give away 1 million cars, 1 million electric cars to people, and receive back the used cars and rehab those and put those on the market. This will drop the used car prices. This will drop the gas prices.
And Congressman McClintock, same question. What should Congress do in response to rising gas and energy prices?
Well, during the Trump administration, we achieved something that few people thought was possible 20 years ago. We had actually achieved energy independence. We were producing more petroleum than Saudi Arabia. We were producing more petroleum than Russia. Gas was selling for about $2 a gallon nationally. The Keystone Pipeline was under construction. Today, it should have been completed, delivering 830,000 barrels of oil a day into American markets. We are now over $1 billion short on our energy, on our petroleum production compared to the pre-COVID era. And there was just a report out, if we had stayed on track, the track that the Trump administration had put us on, we should be producing 2 to 3 billion barrels a day more oil here in this country. When something is plentiful, it's cheap. When it's scarce, it's expensive. On his first day in office, Joe Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline, say goodbye to 830,000 barrels a day. He withdrew federal lands from oil and gas exploration. More recently, he withdrew 1 million acres of federal land in oil-rich Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico from oil production. We have not seen a single drilling permit now approved under this administration. He has taken abundance and turned it into scarcity. And this notion of buying everybody an electric car, I wonder how. Two questions. First of all, who's going to pay for all of those electric cars? And number two, where do you think the electricity is going to come from? 80% of it comes from the very fossil fuels the left is trying to shut down.
Mr. Barkley, did you want 15 seconds to respond to that?
Back when I started driving, gasoline was 18.9 cents a gallon. Those days are not coming. We need to move away from combustion and towards renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, that sort of thing. And the sooner we get there, the less we will be
I'll have to cut you off there with 15 seconds, but I appreciate your response.
Behest of the Saudis.
And I'll remind everybody, at the end of everybody will have 3 minutes of closing comments as well. If there's anything that they wanted to touch on more at the end, there is a time at the end of this forum as well for some closing comments. Next question, staying with Congressman McClintock. I imagine most people have like those 1 or 2 issues that cause you the most concern or kind of keep you up at night. As a congressman, what would you identify as kind of a main issue that you're concerned about?
Oh, the economy, first and foremost. That's of critical importance. And the destruction we've seen just in the last couple of years. You know, if this administration simply done nothing and continued the Trump policies, I'm old enough to remember way back 3 years ago, we had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. We had the lowest poverty rate in 60 years. We had the fastest wage growth in 40 years, and it was very much a working class expansion. Now, the gap between the rich and poor was narrowing for the first time in our lifetimes. It's not all that complicated. We know how to produce a thriving economy. That didn't happen by accident under Trump. It happened because we won one of the biggest tax cuts in American history, which, as I said, actually produced more revenues after we cut taxes because of the economic expansion it produced, as well as the biggest regulatory rollback in American history, some 4 times greater than Ronald Reagan was able to achieve in 8 years. Reduce the tax and regulatory burdens, the economy prospers. Increase those burdens, the economy shrivels. That's what the Biden administration has been doing. As one of the senior members of the House Budget Committee, so much of this comes down to overspending by this government. Once the government has decided to spend a dollar, it's already decided to tax that dollar. And it does it. There's only three possible ways you can pay for it. Current taxes, which reduces your current standard of living. Borrowing, which increases your future, decreases your future standard of living through future taxes, or printing money, which creates the inflation that we're dealing with today. To paraphrase James Carville, it's the spending stupid, and it must be brought under control. When I was the RSC budget chairman, we produced a budget that would balance in 5 years. We've got to get that enacted.
Mr. Barkley, same question. Is there a single issue or topic that kind of causes you the most concern and keeps you up at night?
Always the economy, of course. The Trump tax cut produced huge government deficits, which we're still paying for. But beyond that, the treating of women as property is outrageous, and it needs to stop.
We'll stay on the topic of taxes, which you just mentioned. What is kind of your philosophy on taxes here? Some people say some areas should be taxed more, others should be taxed less. What is your kind of just overall philosophy when it comes to taxes?
That's a tricky question. The recent act, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is what they called it, resurrected a sort of alternative minimum tax for corporations. I think that's a step in the right direction.
Well,
Congressman McClintock,
unfortunately, corporations don't pay corporate taxes. They're only paid in one of three ways. They're paid by consumers as higher prices. They're paid by employees through lower wages, or they're paid as investors through lower earnings. That's your 401k. Mike is right on one point. The deficit did go up after the Trump tax cuts, but that's not because the Trump tax cuts produced less revenue. They produced more revenue. The problem is spending went up at an even faster rate. Like I said, we have got to get that under control, and we're not going to do that by embracing full-scale socialism in this country. What makes the left think that socialism is going to work any better here than everywhere else in the world it's ever been tried? It produces nothing but poverty and misery. It is freedom that produces prosperity, and we need much more of that, especially these days.
Congressman McClintock, there has been some discussion at the federal level about the potential legalization of marijuana. I'm curious where you fall on that issue.
I've always supported legalization, not because I support marijuana. I disapprove of it. My wife and I raised our kids to never go near the stuff. I never went near the stuff. That'll tell you what a creepy little kid I was in the 1970s. So I don't recommend it. But I also don't approve of stamp collecting. It is the prerogative of an individual to make their own decisions through life. Bruce Hershenson once said, we can with enough laws and regulation and enforcement, we can produce a virtually risk-free society, but it will be the most unhappy, miserable, boring, colorless society you could possibly imagine. I do think it's very important to keep marijuana out of the hands of young people. And again, I think that our laws have not only produced a violent underground economy that's done far more harm than good, but it's also made it easier for kids to get marijuana. A sheriff years ago said if I can give a $20 bill to two high school students at random, send one to buy pot, send the other to buy booze, the first one back every time would be the one I send to buy pot. They all know where to get it, and the dealer's has no problem selling it to them. A kid I send out to go buy booze is going to go from one liquor store to another, get carded and kicked out. But the fundamental issue, though, is this violent underground economy that our marijuana laws have produced.
And Mr. Barkley, your opinions about the potential federal legalization of marijuana and where you fall on that issue?
I agree with most of what the congressman said about marijuana. The part about the individual prerogative to make your choice, this is back to the women being treated like property again. And I don't think he is exactly telling the truth about that.
Next question is a little bit not necessarily about the issues themselves, but just kind of what you see your role as a congressman. Mr. Barkley, besides voting in Washington, D.C., how would you kind of describe how you would be as a congressman?
More attentive to the people's needs.
And Mr. McClintock, same question.
Well, that is the role of a congressman, and that's why I fought to get on the Natural Resources Committee, become one of its senior members now, because it's absolutely critical to this district. The water and forest management issues are absolutely essential, and we've made some significant progress in that field, as we've discussed. I sit on the Budget Committee because I believe that is absolutely critical for the nation. And I'm also on the Judiciary Committee as ranking member of the Immigration Committee. It will be my job next year to draft the legislation to secure our borders and assure that this kind of mass illegal migration never occurs again.
You know that when the next Congress is convened, you will be working for 2 more years, at least with the Biden administration. You know, how would you grade the Biden administration during the first 2 years?
I think it's been an abject failure, and the answer to that question is probably best evoked by Ronald Reagan's famous question in 1980. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? That's what this whole campaign, this whole election comes down to across the country. Do you really want to go another 2 years down the path we're on? Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? I keep trying to tell my Democratic colleagues, you can't spin the economy. Everybody knows in their own life how the economy is doing. And if you try to convince them otherwise, as we see the Biden administration doing every day, you simply end up looking foolish. But that's the central issue. We had policies that worked under the Trump administration. Whatever you think of him as a person, those policies produced one of the greatest economic expansions in our lifetimes. The policies that were put into place by this administration are polar opposite, and they're producing polar opposite results. And that's the fundamental question. Do you really want to continue down this road, or would you like to return to the policies that produce prosperity, secure borders, $2 a gallon gasoline, stable prices, and an expanding economy and opportunity for every American?
Mr. Barkley, same question. Your grade of the Biden administration over the past 2 years?
With the three-party system in D.C., it's been tough. But he's gotten a lot done, and he can get a lot more done if we can increase the representation in the Senate. There are a lot of people who are not better off these days than they were 2 years ago. You can drive down the streets of Los Angeles and see every corner of every block occupied by sleeping bags and tents. Let's go back to the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which is when this all started. That got rid of shorter depreciation, alternative minimum tax got imposed, tax preference items, the absence of passive income, and the construction of commercial apartments fell off a cliff. A couple years later, the savings and loan industry went into a free fall. They started bulldozing brand new apartment complexes of 250 units in Texas because they couldn't sell them anymore. When you add to that the Faircloth Amendment in 1998, which put an absolute lid on subsidized housing, and at the same time Congress started cutting subsidies, and then you go to 2008 when the government's reaction to subprime loans caused those to disappear, and only recently have they come back, which meant poor people couldn't buy houses anymore. So you got 30 years of missing apartment construction, 20 years of missing subsidized housing, 10 years of missing small income loans. The only thing that Congress hasn't done is outlaw tents and sleeping bags, and that's why they're all over the place. We should go back and restore the ability of investors to build commercial apartments. We should restore the availability of subsidies for subsidized housing.
Well, I have one more question before we go into closing comments. And, you know, we've hit a number of hot button issues and topics of discussion across the country. And Mr. Barkley, is there anything that I haven't asked you about this evening that you're keeping a close eye on or that you're passionate about?
Well, I am passionate about guns. In civilized countries in the world, guns are privileged. This one doesn't seem to have gotten the message. We're facing 3 million gun deaths in this country over the next century. Eventually, this country will realize that guns should be a privilege and not a right. As for doing anything about that, these things take a long time. Slavery, 75 years to get rid of, and a nasty civil war. Voting rights for women, 72 years. implementing the Civil War amendments with the Voting Rights Act and the Housing Act. That took 100 years. These things take a long time. Someone needs to raise the hand and say, we have a problem here and we know what it is, but we're ignoring it. Eventually, we need to make it a privilege.
Congressman McClintock, any issues that I haven't brought up for this forum today that you're passionate about?
The crime issues we haven't really talked about yet, but since Mike touched on it, I would point out we've got 50 years of experience with gun control laws. They are very effective at disarming law-abiding citizens. They are extremely ineffective at disarming criminals. We know how to produce safe streets. You put the gun criminals behind bars until they are old and gray. You execute the murderers. Those measures worked. But as you look across the country at this defund the police movement of the left, when you see the disrespect that's heaped on officers across the country in the areas where the left controls, and you see the skyrocketing crime rate, we've seen the fastest increase in homicides ever recorded in the past year. When you see these leftist district attorneys refusing to prosecute violations of law, this is a breakdown of society. Without law, there is enforcement. There's no law, and without law, there's no civilization. So I feel that one of the most important things that we are going to need to do is restore that respect for the law, and that starts with this administration enforcing our immigration laws, enforcing court-ordered deportations, getting the criminal gangs off the streets, and prosecuting criminals.
Well, I appreciate both of you answering all those questions. Move now into the closing comment portion of the forum, and I'll go to Mr. Barkley.
The congressman talks about restoring the respect for the law. You might start with Donald Trump, one of the most prolific serial felons in the history of this country. At the point where the congressman will vote to impeach him for the things that he did, then I will believe his comments about respect for the law. Beyond that, I am running to give the people of this district the representation that they ask for and they want, to be their champion in Congress, to listen to them, to vote for the laws that they want, and vote against the ones they don't.
And Congressman McClintock, closing comments.
Well, BJ, thanks again. I have to say I've run a lot of races over the years. I had a lot of opponents. Mike has been a gentleman throughout this race. We may disagree on a lot of things, but he's been a pleasure to discuss issues with, and I want to thank him for fulfilling that important role in any democracy, and that is to air our differences and talk things through. And so I want to thank him for that. I think we all sense that our country's at a crossroads, and we're going to have to choose between two very different paths. One leads to prosperity, abundance, border security, and the freedom that we enjoyed just a few short years ago. The other leads to scarcity, high prices, the anarchy of open borders. Ultimately, I think this election is a choice between policies that work and policies that have failed. 4 years ago, we'd achieved the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. For the first time in our lifetimes, as I said, the gap between rich and poor was shrinking. America was energy independent. And I'll ask that question Ronald Reagan asked one more time. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And if the answer is no, then we have to restore the policies that were making America great again. Reagan's right. Government is the solution to our problem. It's not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Folks know where I stand. I've fought to reduce the size and scope and burdens of government my entire life. I've never faltered in that. That's why taxpayer groups, small business groups, and border security groups have given me one of the highest ratings in the entire Congress over the years. I've always been guided by three uniquely American principles: individual liberty, constitutionally limited government, and personal responsibility. In short, freedom works.
Well, I want to thank Congressman Tom McClintock and Mr. Mike Barkley for taking part in this important conversation ahead of the November 8th general election. Whoever you support, don't forget to vote. I'm BJ Hansen. I was your host, and we thank you for joining us.